2/3 of us these days tell pollsters we don't trust our elected officials. 2/3, it's an astonishing number. We criticize them for kowtowing to special interests, for pandering, being survey-driven, and yet we're the ones who have turned these individuals who seek to be our leaders, and we've turned them into our followers, because if they don't, they lose elections. History has not proven kind to the individual who stands up for principle in an election. That's what happened to Ralph Carr. He lost one of the closest elections in Colorado history in the fall of 1942. Switch one vote in each of the state's roughly 1,600 precincts, and the results would be different. And maybe I've overly romanticized this story, but I like to say that while Ralph Carr did not retain elected office in 1942, he retained something even more important. Ralph Carr retained his conscience. And that's what makes this story bigger than politics and elections, races and votes. Ralph Carr's tale is a life lesson for all of us, because we have all had situations where we did not stand up for what we believed in. Maybe it was back in school, not standing up for the kid on the playground. Maybe it was not standing up for a colleague at work. Maybe we didn't even fight for our own principles. Likely all of us live with some remnant of guilt for not standing up when everybody else was sitting down. There's a poem that's displayed at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. that was written by a German reverend, Martin Niemöller, who spent the last 2 years of the war in a concentration camp. And the poem is as follows. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Ralph Carr, folks, did not wait to speak out. His story is a call to action. If we get another opportunity to be courageous, to stand up for what we believe in, to get past that so common apathy we all have of simply not wanting to cause waves, that we'll grasp it, we'll embrace it. Coincidentally, when I stumbled on Governor Carr's story back in the winter of 2002, I was reading Profiles in Courage by former President Kennedy. And the tales that he shares of stalwarts in the U.S. Senate standing up for political principle to do the right thing has been talked about for decades in civics classes across the country. President Kennedy wrote, "In a democracy, every one of us is in a position of responsibility. And in the final analysis, the kind of government we get depends on how we fulfill our responsibilities." The modern day cliches are, will we walk the walk? Will we practice what we preach? Because as Kennedy concludes, we the people are the boss, and we will get the kind of political leadership, be it good or bad, that we demand and that we deserve. In 1942, the political leadership in Colorado sincerely believed in standing up for the Bill of Rights, for what he felt defined America. And unlike so many of our elected officials today, when he was criticized, and make no mistake about it, folks, he had threats against his life, and there were threats of impeachment. Ralph Carr refused to back down, and he became even more resolute. He said, if you try to do Japanese Americans harm, you must first harm me. Because he had said he had been raised with the shame and the dishonor of race hatred, and he challenged audiences and said it threatens the happiness of you and you and you. Ralph Carr had faith in Coloradans. All he had to do was to get out there and explain that he wasn't standing up for the rights of Japanese Americans, he was standing up for the rights of Americans. It was the Lincoln aficionado in him. He believed, as the former president did, that with public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And so the lesson that's been passed through the generations is that the individual who molds public sentiment goes further than the individual who simply issues executive orders. So Ralph Carr, the man who some said had the oratorical skills to woo the birds off of the trees, sincerely believed in his ability to mold public sentiment. But Ralph Carr was willing to accept his fate to do the right thing. Brings to mind the old quote from the former Missouri Senator Henry Clay, who once said, "It's better to be right than to be president." Interestingly enough, he was never elected president either. But if you had any doubt about Ralph Carr's integrity on this issue and how sincerely he believed in these principles, I want to share with you two stories. The first deals with Michi Terasaki, a woman I met 4.5 months ago at my very first book signing, a Coloradan who had passed the civil service exam before the war, but who couldn't get a job. She approached Governor Carr after a speech that he gave, and this is the story she shares. Governor Carr took her name and her number, called her personally the next week to tell her she had been hired in state government. And if that wasn't enough, she talks about how he called her after Pearl Harbor and said, "If you're scared to come to work, I will send my car and my driver for you." The second story deals with a woman named Wakako Demoto, who was interned at Amachi until Ralph Carr brings her to Denver just a few days before leaving office, after losing an election that he believed he lost because of his stand on behalf of Japanese Americans. Wakako Demoto lives at Ralph Carr's house. He sends her to the Emily Griffith School just down the way here in downtown Denver to further her education, and she serves as a nanny for his first grandchild. All the while, his neighbors are talking to anyone they can talk to. Aren't you worried? Aren't you worried that when you wake up in the morning, this baby is going to be dead? We get the kind of political leadership, folks, be it good or bad, that we demand and that we deserve. When Ralph Carr died in the fall of 1950, he was again running for governor. And by all accounts, he would have won the election. What I love to share is that one of his campaign planks was that he had always stood up for the rights of American citizens. He had always defended the Constitution. And when he died, there were tributes that came in from across the state. And maybe the most poignant came from a political columnist by the name of Alva Swain, who wrote simply, "Ralph Carr was a friend to man. What more needs to be said?" I thank the museum for inviting me here today. I thank you for your time, your patience. Have a wonderful rest of your conference. Thank you so much.